Wonderful worship today, is it not? Amen. Amen. This is it's a deep bench church. When half the worship team and the pastor staff is gone, we still just keep on going because God has blessed this church with a lot of good people, a lot of people that He's placed His anointing and His talent on. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing because not all churches have that. And it's just good. Praise was good today, was it not? I tell you what. When we were practicing on Wednesday, those songs, I just about wanted to change my whole sermon. I already knew what I was going to preach. I almost wanted to change my whole sermon just to be about praise. And I'm not going to do that. But, get it in your heart that if the world that we live in today is as sad and as dark and as depressed, not just depressing, but depressed. And don't you know the praise of His people are going to just absolutely counteract all the negativity and the nasty comments and all that stuff that the world's got in it. The praise is what separates us. The praise is what sets us apart. And if you don't have praise in your heart, that's just, you can get it. God can provide it. The same God that created the heavens and the earth in 6 days is more than capable of putting praise in your heart if you just ask Him to and you just lend yourself to Him, be willing. Okay, do I sound all right? Okay, I didn't know. It's a little hissy up here, and I don't mind, but you might. So I can always switch to a microphone if I need to. So I'm what you get today. Pastor Dennis is out playing with his family today, I think, having a good time. It's a beautiful, beautiful day, and I'm just pleased to be up here. I'd like to open in prayer, and then we'll get started today. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you so much. Like we talked about in all the songs that we sang today, you are praiseworthy, and it is our pleasure. It is our blessing to be able to praise you, Lord, and we are so grateful. We ask today, Lord, that you just be in here with us. We know that you already are, that you dwell in this place, Lord, that you touch every single heart, that you reach into every mind, and that you use me as a vessel for your word today, Lord, and sink it deep into all of our hearts. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. So a little bit behind the veil of how messages come together. I usually have 2 or 3 or 4 or something, little notes of things that have occurred to me. I'm like, ooh, that'll preach. You know, just kind of write that down, and it's just kind of sitting in a repository somewhere. But then when Dennis asks me to preach, or sometimes just before he asks me to, there are times when that happens too, something will come to me. I'm doing something. Usually something kind of mindless. I like mindless manual tasks because they give you a lot of time to think if you don't fill your head with a bunch of other stuff. And I was weeding a garden for my mom, actually, for Mother's Day. My wife took my mom, her and the sisters-in-law, took mom to go make baskets or some girly junk that girls do. And the men folks stayed behind. Me and Dad were weeding Mom's flower beds so that when she came home, she'd have weeded flower beds. And I got to thinking as I was weeding these flower beds, and I was like, I thought I knew what I was going to preach about, but no, this is what I'm going to preach about. And then God showed me, no, those two things go together. And that's how you know that God's in it. It all just kind of falls together, and the verses just have things in them you didn't even remember that they had in them. So I trust that today's word is the Lord's. So on that day before Mother's Day, as I'm weeding the flowers, you can't always tell. I'm not a flower guy, you know. I can't always tell the difference between what's a flower and what's a weed, because some weeds are kind of pretty. In fact, one day, Carter and I were swinging by to just say hi to Jenny at the bank, and I saw this pretty weed. I mean, it's probably a weed because it's like this tall and it's growing somewhere where nobody is tending anything. But it was kind of pretty. And so I cut the top off of it and I brought it into her and I was like, here, babe, a weed for you. But I thought it was a pretty weed. So I can't tell the difference between what's flower and what's a keeper. But when you're in there in the flower bed, you can kind of tell the stuff that's growing unwillingly, the stuff you're coaxing to grow, and the things that are just virulent. And so, I'm pulling this stuff out. And what happens as you're weeding a flower bed is first you get in there and you can take out by clumps the junk that is all by itself, that's out in the middle, that is clearly not a flower that you want to keep. And then you just kind of work your way in. And the very last thing that you can remove, because it's the nail biter stuff, is that brave little weed that grew right next to the flower. It's right there. And you just know you're going to uproot the flower when you try to uproot the weed. And so you save that one for last. So that makes me think about a very obvious parable here. So Matthew chapter 13, verse 24. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came to him and said, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?'" Just occurred to me. Sorry, I paused in the middle there, but so many people blame God for all the problems in the world. Like, God, what do you make all these cantankerous people for? God, what did you make evil in the world for? God, why is there sickness? God, why is there death? Like, didn't you buy good seed? That just occurred to me. Like, we blame God for that. Like, yeah, I bought good seed. Don't you think I know what I'm doing? "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?" And he said to them, "Well, an enemy has done this." So the servants said to him, "Well, do you want us to go and gather them?" And he said, "No, lest in the gathering you root up the wheat along with them. Just let them both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, gather the wheat into my barn." So a lot of people struggle with this problem of evil in the world, which we're going to talk about kind of the nature of the evil in all of us today. But we question, why does God allow these things to happen? It's right here in the scripture. I mean, Jesus told them why evil exists in the world, why good things happen to bad people. Why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Jesus spelled it out right here in this parable. Don't you know what would happen if you planted weeds and wheat in the same field? They're going to get the same sun. They're going to get the same rain. Good people will prosper. Evil people will also prosper. Bad things will happen. Hail will fall and damage the plants. And sometimes it'll damage the good plants. Because that's the way it works. And that's the way God has ordained it to be. And when the harvest time comes, he'll sort it all out. No matter what you do, you're always going to have a weed in your flower bed. I got worse ones this year than I've ever had before. You can put down weed fabric, you can mulch, you can weed and feed, you can do all that stuff, but there's always going to be a weed in your flower bed. And the topic that I recognized these two messages went together, Jesus had a weed in his flowers. He handpicked disciples to follow him. But there was a weed in the flowers. So today's title is I, Judas. Because there's something about Judas. He's more than just this son of perdition that had to be there to sell Jesus out to the Pharisees and make it possible for Jesus to be crucified. There's more to him than that one simple little part of his story. Judas is a relatable character. And what I am asking you to do today is to relate to Judas. Not sympathy for Judas. That's different. But relate to him and understand there is a quality in him that is present in me and that I have to weed out of my own heart. Okay, so there's a Judas tendency, and that's what we want to talk about today. We don't know exactly when Judas joined the disciples. Some of the disciples we know. The Bible tells us the order in which Jesus called them. We know about Peter and James and John and Andrew, and it tells us that. It does not specifically say, and then this is what was going on when Jesus called Judas, so we don't know that. It's actually kind of interesting how little we really know about these disciples of Jesus, but it wasn't ever about them. The gospel isn't about the disciples. The gospel is all about him. So I think it's wonderful that the Bible doesn't even bother to try to tell us all those little details. We know that Judas had to be there early because very early on, the Bible starts referring to them as the 12. So we know Judas was among them by that time. With the exception of Jesus healing the first demon possession, we don't know if Judas was with him when he did that because the Bible isn't really clear about it. And it's likely that Judas wasn't there when he healed Peter's mother-in-law when she was laying sick, and a few little physical healings. But for everything else that Jesus did, all the wonderful miracles Jesus did, Judas would have been there. He would have been there to see all of that miraculous stuff. So Judas was present and listening when Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount, which is such a powerful message, such a powerful sermon that I bet, and I'd never bothered to think about this until I was starting to write it down. I'll bet since the moment Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, there's not been a month, maybe not a week, that has ever gone by in human history that somebody hasn't preached that message, which is a powerful thought to think about. Jesus preached a message so intensely powerful, people are still repeating it, probably weekly, and always, always, always have. And Judas was there for that, heard it in person, didn't just hear it from a great preacher, didn't just hear it in a great read through it in a powerful Bible study or a powerful praise song. They were there when God himself spoke it. Judas was sitting there and heard that. And it had to be a powerful, moving message for a lot of people. He watched him raise a widow's son from the dead. Jesus is walking into town, just walking into town, and he sees a group of people carrying a litter between them, up on their shoulders or whatever. And there's this young man laid out there, and he's passed away, and his poor widowed mother is trailing in behind crying. And Jesus walks up and says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "You don't need to cry. The boy is not dead. He just sleeps. Wake, arise." And the guy sits right up on the funeral cot. And you know you're carrying weight. When weight is stable, you can easily carry it. But when it starts shifting around, it gets weird. Don't you know those guys are like, "Oh, easy, dude." Had to lay that thing down. And what a cool moment to be present for. Judas watched that. He watched the dead rise, and not once. He watched it again. We'll talk about that in a second. There was a time when Jesus was apart from the disciples, had gone up. I got to fight this thing. When Jesus had gone apart from them, and they were out on the ship in the storm, and it wasn't the kind of big, safe yacht kind of boat that you might think people ride in. It's more or less a John boat, a big John boat's what they're riding in the water in, on the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee is kind of like one of the Great Lakes, If you're on it and you're out in the middle of it, there's no land anywhere in sight, and you might as well be on the ocean. The waves are huge. There are tidal forces and stuff, and it's scary when you're out there. And he was there when Jesus... they're all panicking, and there's water. The boat's taking on water, and Jesus steps up and says, "Chill, guys. Peace, be still." He was there when they were alone on the boat in the sea, and waves were pushing, and the wind was pushing on the boat, and it's like 3:00 in the morning, and Jesus comes walking across the water. That's crazy. He's been there to see every single one of these amazing miracles. But it's not changing him. It's not changing him. He watched a young boy come up to Jesus with 2 fish and 5 dinner rolls, and Jesus feed 5,000 people with it. And that moved people, and that, especially for the disciples. I don't know, the people who were sitting there eating the meal, I don't know how many of them even really realized the miracle that was happening, because in the crush of a giant crowd like that, how could you even see what was being done, right? They probably didn't realize that this entire meal for 5,000 people came from 5 dinner rolls and 2 fish. But the disciples knew it. The disciples were there. They saw the food, the very meager portion that Jesus had to work with. They saw the massive people filled, and then they saw the baskets full of food that was left over when it was over. Miracle. Amazing. Don't you think if you were there and you saw that happen, if that's the only miracle you ever witnessed, was Jesus taking that bread? I mean, we're talking about raising the dead, right? But if the only thing you ever saw was him feed 5,000 people with 5 Hawaiian sweet rolls from G&W, wouldn't that be enough to just make you never, ever question him again? To make you just go in with whatever it was that he wanted to do? Judas watched Jesus turn the world upside down, showing value to people who society did not value. To the sick, to lepers, to women and children who were not particularly well thought of, weren't thought of as, ranking members of society. And Jesus had time for them, and he treated them like he would treat anybody else. He reached his hand out to dirty, infectious, leprous people and dirty, orphaned children, and set them on his knee, and miraculous healings. I would think it would be amazing to see what that would do to a person's faith, to be on the front lines and see that kind of thing. But God hasn't changed, and he still performs miracles. The building you're sitting in is miraculous. The chairs that you're sitting in are miraculous. These things were provided. The drywall finishing on the walls and the paint on the walls is miraculous. Not because drywall magically appeared on our porch. That didn't happen, although I wouldn't put it past God to do it. It wouldn't surprise me if we went and got a sheet and we were a sheet short and didn't know it. And when we went back, when we got the next to last one, there was another next to last one. It wouldn't surprise me if God didn't do that. He might have. I don't know. I wouldn't know. But I know that the days when we would have one of those loads of drywall show up for $5,000, somebody'd show up with a $2,000 check, and somebody else would show up with a $3,000 check, and somebody would show up and say, "Oh, I'll donate, 300 chairs for your church." Who does that? Who donates 300 chairs for your church? All the drywall finishing in this building, if you didn't know that, and all the painting in this building, we didn't pay a dime for any of it. The gentleman that did it was a professional. It's what he did for a living. And he had a crew here, and we said, "Dude, we can be a little patient. I know you've got other jobs. If you'll come work on our job in between your jobs, that's great." And you can keep your guys busy. And we had a lot of things going on in here. So it's not like they were holding us up. We had a lot to do. And they came in and did all that finishing. And, he's looking on the walls and he's like, "I've got a paint that I've just got some sitting around. I think it would probably match what you're doing in here." And my wife's the master of color, so she was the one who kind of picked some colors. And she's like, "Actually, I think that'll work." And so some of the nursery I know is painted with that paint. When it was all said and done, and we went to pay the man, he wouldn't let us pay him. Isn't that crazy? That gentleman I don't think he lived even just a few months after doing this job. He passed away. Just miraculous things. I don't know that guy even existed before he came and did this job. For all I know, God just spoke him into existence, had him come finish our drywall, and took him right back out. I don't know. It's amazing. God hasn't changed. His miracle working hand has not changed. We can look at Judas and say, "What is wrong with you, dude? You watched him raise the dead, and yet clearly your heart is not changed." We witness miracles all the time. I mean, we've been following, probably a lot of you have been following what's been going on with Peyton Newman, the young man he lives here in Willow. His wife is Ashton, takes a lot of pictures and stuff. Yes. I'm sorry. Peyton Newman, I know him too. We were talking about Peyton Newman yesterday, and that's what got it in my head, I think. Peyton Turnbull, I'm sorry. His wife, Ashton, is a photographer around here. And, Peyton should have died. They went in to do heart surgery on him to replace a valve on his heart, and they kind of accidentally pierced 3 different places in his heart, and all the blood in his heart. You said his blood pressure was 20/0. 20/0. When we had heard that his blood pressure was 20, my wife's like, "Oh, they must have meant his pulse was 20. No. His blood pressure was 20/0. He should have died, and he did not die. And the reason why he did not die is because he's got a lot of people praying for him. Going into that surgery, during that surgery, coming out of that surgery, because God does miraculous things. He's amazed the people at that hospital with what Peyton has been able to do, and he's doing well. He's doing really well. And that's God working. So we can look at Judas and say, why could you not believe when the miracles were right in front of your face? Folks, the miracles are right in front of our face now. They happen all the time. We've seen it happen right here in the four walls of this church and in the four walls of that church over there. And probably people could share things that they know about, miraculous healings and stuff that maybe I don't even know about. So what I want to show you now is kind of what happens in the lives of some of the other disciples, who they are before and after Jesus spends some time with them. So I want to show you first brothers, James and John. So James and John, Jesus nicknamed them Boanerges, which is an Aramaic word because Jesus spoke Aramaic. And it literally translates sons of rage. Now, our Bible translates it as sons of thunder, which you can see the connection between rage and thunder. And I think sons of thunder is, if nothing else, it's a much cooler name. I would rather be called the son of thunder than I would be the son of rage. But you got to understand, the words are the same for a reason. These guys were a little rough. They were push them, they're going to push you back, right? Sons of rage, sons of thunder, they were probably a handful. Check this out. This is a great example of just so you get to know who these guys are. So let me set the stage a little bit for a second. Jesus, at one point, he'd been with the disciples for a while, and they'd seen him perform a lot of miracles. And he said, now I'm going to send you out, and I'm going to let you do some miracles in my name. Go out and do some good work. Go out and spread the gospel. And so these guys go out, and when they come back, they're like, Jesus, even demons were subject to our word. We were able to put our hand on people, and the demons fled. And he's like, yeah, that's cool. You're going to see even cooler things than that. Just hold tight. Right? So they'd done that. They'd gone out. They'd come back. And so, these guys are already kind of high on life from the experiences that they had. It's pretty exciting to get up and preach and know that you've got a good word from God. And sometimes the things that come out of my mouth are not as dumb as saying Peyton Newman when I knew it was Peyton Turnbull. But sometimes things come out of your mouth that are not your own words, and that's pretty exciting. But to say words and demons to flee, that's got to be something, right? So these guys come back, and James and John are already kind of hot-headed, and they get back, and they're on fire for God. And it says in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So Jesus is headed to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. Now, the Samaritans and Jews do not get along. They don't like each other. So if the Samaritans know, they've heard who Jesus is, right? They know that this guy's supposed to be the king of the Jews. He's on his way to Jerusalem, which is a Jewish capital city. So the Samaritans don't really want him to go. They're not going to help him. So in verse 53, the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when the disciples James and John saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Hey, God, you want us to go all Old Testament on these dudes? You want us to Elijah these guys for you? We're happy to do it. Here we go. Here it comes. Here comes the fire, right? And Jesus is like, dude, no, I don't want you to do that. I do not want you to go all Elijah on these punks. I really don't. They got their boldness, honestly. This is a family tradition for James and John. I want to show you this too. Matthew chapter 20, verse 20. The mother of the sons of Zebedee, that means James and John's mom, came up to him with her sons. And kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, what do you want? And she said, say that my two sons are to sit, one on your right hand and one on your left in your kingdom. Whew, that's a bold ask, is it not? Out of all of the people who've ever lived, ever, and all the people who will ever live, ever, this lady was bold enough to say, can my sons sit at your right hand and left hand? Like, wow, you must think a lot of your kids, right? I know where these kids got it. Jesus answered, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I am to drink? They said to him, James and John, oh yeah, we're able. Man, you don't know what you're signing on for. The cup Jesus is going to drink is going to be crucifixion, is going to be Scourging is going to be standing up to the powers of hell and triumphantly reigning, but golly, through a massively painful ordeal that he had to go through. And Jesus said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant. It's for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." James and John will see that. We'll talk about that in a minute. So James and John are kind of full of spit and vinegar. They're not the only ones. Jesus has also got Peter. Peter's the hair trigger, the impulsive disciple. When he heard of Jesus, it's likely that Peter would have heard about Jesus coming from John the Baptist, probably. And so he's one of Jesus's very early, maybe his very first follower, and he's going around and he's watching Jesus do miraculous things, but he must have been kind of riding the fence just a little, because the moment of his conversion, the Bible gives us, and it's not when he watched Jesus cast a demon out of a man, and it's not when he even healed Peter's mother-in-law. Of course, I don't know what Peter's relationship with his mother-in-law was. That's a joke. I love my mother-in-law. Like, oh, you healed her. That's good. That's really good. Thank you. Because I think I've read that so many times as Peter's mother. I know it says mother-in-law, but I think I've just, in my head, just allowed myself to think of it as Peter's mom. It's his mother-in-law, not his mom. Anyway, that's a joke. My mother-in-law is fantastic. I would want Jesus to heal you, Olive.
I'll give you some money.
She's going to pay me later. You don't have to do that either. We'll do it quietly later. So it wasn't then. This is the moment when it hit close to home for Peter. So Peter was a fisherman. And it's in the fishing boat that Jesus converts Peter. But it also shows you, again, this impulsive nature that Peter has, I think, is very clearly laid out in this story. Luke chapter 5, verse 1. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he, that would be Jesus, is standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, which is Peter, Simon Peter, he asked him to put out a little from land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let your nets down for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets." So I think in the timeline of things in the Bible, this is, from the way I understand it, this happens after the healings that Peter has already seen. And now he's in the boat and Jesus has already preached his message, and they're probably kind of like, okay, well, that's done. Kind of like everybody is when the last song happens and church is about to let out. Everybody's attitudes are a little bit different. You kind of start thinking about your day and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, "Just throw your nets down." Peter's like, yeah, okay, we'll do it. And when they'd done this, verse 6, they enclosed a large number of fish. Their nets were breaking. Fished all night and didn't catch anything. And now they've got their nets so full that they're breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help. And they came and they filled both the boats so that they began to sink. That is a miraculous catch of fish. Healing the mother-in-law didn't do it. Casting demons out. But a good catch of fish changed Peter's mind. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." That's when you know. How do you know that somebody's had their heart changed? They immediately recognize, my righteousness is as filthy rags. I recognize the weight of my own sin. And Peter recognized it in that moment. Oh my goodness, this guy is exactly who he claims to be. And he falls at his knees and says, "Forgive me. Oh, I'm a sinful man." When he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they'd taken, and so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." Jesus already got a job for him to do. And when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Peter saw some awesome things, but that moment that he was converted, the minute his heart changed, he hit his knees, he asked for forgiveness. Jesus said, don't you worry, I'm going to put you to work right away. And they got their boats in and just never went back. They do go back for a minute. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. But they're not really ever going to go back. He was willing to just change his entire life. Peter's not going to go home every night and hang his nets out to dry and clean his catch. He's going to go trudge all over the known world preaching the word of God, and he's never going to stop until the day that they stop him by martyrdom. That's a pretty powerful change that Peter had. Later, but I don't want to miss this. Peter's still an impulsive guy. I don't want to miss that. Later, Jesus had been pressed by the crowd so much, he needed to get away and be alone to just pray for a little while. And so the disciples get on the boat, and I kind of referenced this earlier when I was talking about Judas, because Judas would have seen this. They're out on a boat. Jesus is up on a mountain, and they're going to cross the water on their own. And the Bible tells us that there's wind pressing against the boat, and it's probably not some big crazy hurricane storm or something, but it's not pleasant. It's spitting rain and wind and stuff. And it's sometime, it tells us it's in the fourth watch of the night, which is sometime between 3 a.m. and dawn. And they're out on this boat, kind of a little bit freaked out probably. And there's spray and waves and choppy stuff. And Peter looks out and he sees what he thinks is a ghost floating over the water. Because you don't see too many people hanging out in the middle of the sea in the middle of the night. And so he sees this, robed form kind of moving across the water, and he's like, it's a ghost. And they're all kind of freaked out, like, are we seeing a ghost right now? And he looks out and he's like, I don't think that's a ghost. I think I know that guy. And he does, he sees Jesus walking on the sea. And the second he recognizes it's Jesus, he's like, whoa, dude is walking on the water. That's cool. Jesus, I want to come walk out on the water to be with you. We've all, there's been moments in all of our lives, especially with little kids, you're doing something yucky. I don't know, the other day Carter and I were over at Mom and Dad's, and I was in their pool, and it's slimy and, stuff. Their whole pool liner fell in over the winter, and it's all sludgy, gross in there. And I'm out there wading in the muck, and Carter's like, Dad, can I come in there with you? And I'm like, yeah, knock yourself out, kid, rolling up his pant legs to get in the water to help me with the pool liner. There's something in us that's kind of got that energy when we're young. A lot of us grow out of it. I think if you guys had been there and watched me mucking around in the bottom of the pool, you'd be like, you're doing a great job. You just keep it up. But I'm out there in that, and he wants to get in it. He sees Jesus on that water. He's like, I can't wait for Jesus to get to the boat. And if I go out to him, I'm going to get a cool one-of-a-lifetime opportunity to walk on water. I wonder what that felt like. Can you imagine what that would feel like to walk on water? It's solid and it could support his weight, but I got to think it squished up between his toes a little bit. I got to think that it did. And so he gets out on that water and he just takes a couple steps. Because he's so impulsive, those first couple of steps came without any thought. He just went right out there. And he's out there, and then the thoughts creep in and he realizes, this is not even physically possible, what I'm doing. And he immediately starts to sink, right? And Jesus has to haul him out of the water. So James and John are headstrong and probably bullies before they meet Jesus. I'm going to guess they're probably bullies before they meet Jesus. Peter's impulsive to the point that he will lash out in violence. Peter is the one who immediately whips the sword out when the guys try to arrest Jesus and slices the dude's ear off. I don't know if that was a well-timed strike or if that was just a total miss and he was trying to kill the dude. But he knocks the guy's ear off. Jesus has to put it back on. So they've got their issues. They're not perfect. So when we talk about Judas and the kind of guy Judas was, for starters, he's not any different than any of the other disciples. Judas had his hang up, but everybody's got their hang up. Peter's got a hang up. James and John have got a hang up. I guarantee you, Matthew and all the other ones had them too. Thaddeus. They've all got hang ups. So I want to take you to a place in John chapter 12. where we find out what Judas's hang-up is. And we just kind of see his character play out. This is John chapter 12. So we're deep in. I mean, Jesus has pretty much done all the miracles he's going to do that the Bible records for us anyway. And we know there's other things he did that are not recorded. But he's seen it all. He's done it all. He's been with them through thick and thin, years of time with the Lord. John chapter 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So Judas is sitting at the table with not only God himself in flesh, which is awesome, but you know when you've hung out with a guy for 3 years, you probably start to get a little used to it. That's sad that we can get used to something as cool as hanging out in the presence of God, but I bet it kind of became like, oh, well, there's Jesus' healing again. You know how he does. It just kind of became routine. But he's sitting at the table with a man who was dead for 4 days and isn't dead anymore. That's pretty impressive. And yet, verse 2, so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Not only is Lazarus there, he is having meal with him. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, which doesn't sound like anything I would want to pay a lot of money for, but apparently is pretty awesome. I would name it something better, but you know, whatever. Nard. I made a joke and lost my place. I'll find it. Give me a minute. And anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. What a powerful image that is. The house is filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Judas is sitting here at this meal, which he's sat in a lot of meals with Jesus. But he probably hasn't sat at a lot of meals with Jesus in the presence of somebody who he raised from the dead. And then this woman comes in and opens up this perfume, and the whole house is just full of this beautiful fragrance. And she is bawling her eyes out and cleaning this man's feet with her hair. Such a humbling thing. Such a powerful moment. In powerful moments like that, I can't hardly look people in the face. It's just so much. It's so heavy. Her humility would have been so heavy, it would have been hard to look at what was going on. And he's sitting here in this moment, and you got to know, I mean, I would probably cry. I would probably cry a little and try to hide it if I were there. And I think a lot of us would probably feel that way. Because your heart just goes out to somebody like that. And the heaviness of the moment just is so clear. But look what Judas is doing. Verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Way to miss the point, man. What in the world? I'm kind of bad about this, that I will not, I want to get the last value out of everything. And I will squeeze the toothpaste tube until there is absolutely nothing left. My wife just relegates end of the tube toothpaste work to me because she's ready to throw it out. I'm like, no, there's more in there. And I'll set her down and I'll rake it with my thumbnail, you know, like we're not destitute, but it's the principle of the thing. I want to get the last bit out of it. The other day, there was a little bit of water on the floor because in the bathroom, sometimes we'll set up our ironing board in there, and it had leaked some of the water you put in it for steam on the floor. And she just took my towel that I had probably only used once or twice, and she cleaned the water up off the floor with it. And I was like, that towel was still good. She's like, we're not throwing it away. I could have got another use or two out of that towel. You know, like that's in my heart of hearts, that's just who I am. I want to get the good out of it. And so I get where Judas is coming from when he says, dude, we could have sold that for $300. And it's not $300, it's 300 denarii. It's a ridiculously huge sum of money. And he just totally missed the point. I like to think in that moment, I wouldn't have even thought about the price of the perfume. that I would have understood, that my heart would have been such that I would have understood the gravity of the moment. But Judas totally misses it. And John clears this up for us in case we were curious as to why he said that in verse 6. He said this not because he actually cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So Judas is walking around this whole time, literally holding the bag. Because back then they had a purse full of coins. And Judas was the guy who was trusted with the money. I would love to know what the qualities were specifically that caused Jesus to choose all of the disciples. And one day I can ask him if I even care. A lot of the things that we talk about, we're like, man, when I get to heaven, nope, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to ask any of that stuff. Because it's going to be so dadgum awesome. We're not going to care one flying flip about any of the stuff from this world. We're not going to care about how things worked. We're not going to care about what you thought in a particular moment. We will have eternity to talk about it. So maybe it'll come up in a few millennia. But it's probably not going to be on our mind right first off. But I would love to know, what quality was it that he was looking for in all of the disciples? And you got to know, being a little persnickety about the money is an important job. Jesus said, a lot of times we're going to be going out somewhere and we're not going to have even a place to lay our head. We're not going to have a dollar, but God's going to provide. He's always going to be there to make sure we get fed and we get taken care of. And I'm sure they had some tummy grumbly, hungry nights out there on the road. I bet they did. And they needed a guy who could, rub two pennies together and get an extra penny out of it. And Judas is that guy. He served the purpose during the time that they were on the road. It was a necessary skill. But we can't let our skill, our predilections, become a stumbling block. I mean, if the reason why one of these guys was chosen was because of his powerful oratory and that he could just charm the living daylights out of anybody, that individual cannot allow that to become pride in their own, like they just like hearing their own voice. You can't let it turn into that. And Judas, his skill is a skill, but gone wrong, it turns into a covetous heart. And here he is with this covetous heart, just he's stealing out of the money bag. The whole time, Jesus is raising the dead and he's stealing out of the money bag. But dadgummit, don't we steal out of the money bag? Proverbially speaking, I don't mean literally. I hope you're not pulling things out of the offering plate when it goes around. I hope you're not. But don't we though? I mean, don't we, knowing who Jesus is and knowing the things he's done, and even having seen with our own eyes some of the things that he has done, we sneak that sin in there. We rob out of the money bag. We do something we know we're not supposed to do. And we knew we weren't supposed to do it before we did it. And we made our mind up to go through with the thing, the thought, the act, whatever it was that we knew was unholy. It's no different. It's no different than pilfering out of the money bag. Got to find my space now. Okay. So at this table where Judas is lamenting over the loss of the cash that he could have robbed, at that table, so we're going to see another table. That's where my notes are. I found my spot now. Just a few days later, they're going to be at another table. They're going to be at the Last Supper table. And now it's just the disciples and Jesus. And Judas he still hasn't changed. That heart in him that did not value what that woman was doing for Jesus, that heart that was willing to pilfer from the money bag all along, still hasn't changed. So I've got the Last Supper here, and I'm reading from Matthew's account, but I'm pulling a verse from John in because John gives us a little detail that Matthew doesn't give us. So just if you watch, you're going to see it's all Matthew chapter 26, and then there's a sneaky John in there. I'll tell you when it's coming, so you don't think I'm trying to snow you or something. As they were eating, so this is Matthew 26, verse 21. As they were eating, He, Jesus, said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" And he answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish will betray me." Down to verse 25. Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Is it I, Judas? And he said to him, "You have said so." And then after he'd taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, what you're going to do quickly. John gives us that detail. It's that moment that Satan enters him. The difference between Judas and the other disciples is the time in Jesus' presence did not change who he was. Now, we're going to find at the end of this message, Peter is still impulsive. James and John are probably still hot-headed and loud. But they do it for the Lord. Peter may be impulsive, but it's metered with this wisdom that he's starting to get. His passion is wholly God-related now. And in time, as he's going around and preaching and delivering the word, particularly to the Jews, that God slowly worked him into the man he wanted him to be. And I'm sure that energy that Peter had that made him so impulsive never went away in his whole life. But it was metered with a wisdom and a knowledge that came from time in God's presence. And James and John, the same. We get to know how John's story plays out, and we get to see the long game on what can happen to somebody when they spend a lot of time alive after having been in Jesus' presence. James does not get that opportunity. James is the very first of the disciples to be martyred, which means that hot head of his and that loud mouth of his preaching the gospel probably got him in trouble, which is exactly what God needed him to do. I'm getting so far off my notes. I gotta keep on this thing. Spending time in the presence of God for Judas, it didn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything if it doesn't transform you. And what was occurring to me as I was weeding the flower bed, and there's that one weed that's right up next to the flower, and it's the last one to pull, and maybe you're not even bold enough to pull it. Maybe you're like, I'll just let that one go because it's not going to detract too much from the flower. One day, it'll be separated. One day, the flower gets trimmed and put in the vase, and the weed gets plowed under. Maybe I don't even know the difference between the flower and the weed, but God knows. The master gardener knows. What occurred to me as I was in that weedy patch is right here in my own heart, and definitely within the church, there's always going to be this little thing in me, and there's always going to be somebody. We're standing here, we show up on Sunday morning, I come, I stand up when they tell me to stand up because, it'd be weird to be the one person sitting in a room full of everybody else standing. But the praise music just hits and drops. It's not getting in. It's not getting in, and it's not tilling this heart. The whole reason why we have praise at the beginning of worship is not so we get to rock out, although that's fun. It's because the music, if you pay attention to the words, and I've heard people complain sometimes that, these contemporary songs, they just repeat the same thing over and over and over again. I'll tell you what, I've been through some old hymns that were going 900 miles an hour with so many words, I don't even know what we're saying. There's something about, and that's fine, there's sometimes those hymns have got good stuff in them, but there's sometimes I got to sing the song 10 times to even know what it says. There's been times when I was singing a hymn that I've sang since I was a little bitty kid, and it finally, at like 40, is like, oh, I know what that means now. I've been singing it all this time, didn't know what it means. That repetitive part of the song, that's not just so we get to play it longer. It's because it's a truth that's supposed to occur to you. And if you sing it 16 times, maybe it'll eventually occur to you and plow that heart to be ready to receive the seed of the word. And if you come in and the music isn't doing it for you, maybe it's the music, maybe it's not your flavor, but maybe it's a condition of the heart. And if while the preacher's preaching, you're fantasizing about what you're going to do after church, maybe it's not sinking in. Judas walked with Jesus, and yet it didn't sink in. If the powerful aura of Jesus cannot transform a bullheaded person's life, God help us that we can't do it. I can't do it. I just pulled that off. Even with God's help, I can't do it. Satan entered Judas at that moment. It wasn't unwilling. Jesus stands at the door and knocks. And you have to open the door and ask him to come in. Because he's not going to come in if he's not wanted. The devil looks for a door that's cracked open, and he just pries his way in. When Satan entered Judas, it wasn't some crazy like poltergeist possession. It was a heart he left open. As he's sitting there thinking about the money, thinking about his own pet sin that he just isn't even trying to conquer, he's left that door open for the devil to get in and do what he wants to do. And as I'm pulling these weeds out of mom's flower bed, I'm thinking, God, don't let there be anything in me, any weed that can't get pulled. Don't let there be a person in this church who stands up among the flowers and for all intents and purposes looks like a flower. I don't know the difference between the weeds and the flowers. I can't tell. Y'all got pretty petals as far as I'm concerned. But God knows the difference between the weeds and the flowers. And I want to be clear about this. Every one of those disciples was a weed to begin with. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and you got to be grafted on. I'm just a weed, but when Jesus prunes me and grafts me on, you know what happens to a plant when it gets grafted on? The outside doesn't change, but the inside does. It's getting its goodie, its nutrients, its source is now the vine. An apple branch grafted on to a different tree still makes apples. It still makes the same apple it made before. But the inside is changed. It's been transformed. An unhealthy plant can be grafted onto a healthy stem and become healthy. And that's it. Peter doesn't change. Peter's still impulsive. James and John don't change. They're still hot-headed. But what's in them changes. Judas didn't change. He never got grafted on. And I don't want anybody in this, I don't want anything in me to be left ungrafted. And I don't want anybody in here to be left ungrafted. And if the praise music bounces off and if the message bounces off and you're kind of just coming in punching a time clock, it's not doing you any more good than Judas was done by being in Jesus' presence. And how do you fix it? You don't, because you can't. But God can, and he will. And if you think, he can't change me, what makes you so special? He changed everybody else. He can't change you. Oh, well, aren't you? I'd like to meet you. Yeah, you're so special that God can't transform you. God transformed the dadgum universe to operate on his timing. He can fix your heart if you let him. You just have to invite him to do it. Just have to invite him to do it. Judas was just looking for an exit strategy. Oh, let's see here. What have I got left that I haven't covered? I think I got way off, but that's okay. Yeah. I wrote down here, are you coming here to play house or are you being transformed? Is your heart changed? If it's not changed, that's okay. You got time. You're still alive. Let God transform you. Judas sat there and heard that, and it didn't change him, but God can change each of us. I want to show you this. After Jesus' death and resurrection, he'd already appeared to the disciples. He'd already appeared to the disciples. This didn't actually really sink into me until I was teaching the kids on Wednesday night one week. So, Peter and James and John and Andrew and all of them, they're up in the upper room, and Jesus has been dead. He's been resurrected, and he appears in the room, and they all receive the Holy Spirit. So Peter's already had a pretty awesome transformative experience with Jesus. It's no surprise to him that he has been resurrected from the dead. And I think when I read the passage I'm about to read before, I was allowing myself to think, oh, Peter is just now realizing that Jesus is resurrected. No, he's not. He knows Jesus is resurrected. Check this out. John chapter 21, verse 7. Peter's out fishing. He's in his boat. And this should sound familiar because we had a moment earlier where Peter is in a boat and Jesus says, throw your nets down. And he's like, I ain't going to catch anything. I've been fishing all night. And he's like, just do it. And he does it, and there's a bunch of fish. John chapter 21, verse 7. The disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John. We'll talk about that too. Said to Peter, it is the Lord. It's the Lord. It's Jesus out there. When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord. So they're in the boat. This guy on the shore says, catching anything? And Peter says, no, not all night. Lower your nets down on the right side of the boat. Oh yeah, like we never tried that before. Okay. It's Jesus. Peter's like, it's Jesus. What does Peter do? He strips off his outer garment, throws himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. They were not far from the land, but 100 yards off, 100 yards away, Peter sees Jesus, who he has already seen, who he already knows is resurrected. He's like, it's Jesus. And he rips his shirt off, jumps in the water, and swims 100 yards to get to him. I don't want a Judas heart. I want a Peter heart. Right? Like, I want to be transformed the way Peter was transformed. Not to miss being transformed the way Judas was, but to be transformed the way Peter was. And we know Peter goes on to just do massive, wonderful, amazing things for God. And we know that James goes on to preach the gospel strongly and passionately enough that people think they got to kill him. And they martyr him early. And we know that John, he's the picture of what we get to become if we get to live to be a ripe old age. When you read John's gospel, it's different than all the other ones because John wrote it last. All the other ones were out and published and circulated. And John's like, well, I'm going to tell you all the good stuff that wasn't in the other ones. And John oozes love. He uses the word love or a synonym for love like 100 times more than anybody else. If the word love is in the Bible somewhere and you don't know what you're looking for, just open John. Odds are that's the one you're looking for because he uses it so much. This hot-headed, passionate dude who was probably thumping heads is transformed into this old man who is just gushing with love because that's who God transformed him into over the course of his life. If you're not particularly proud of who you are, God can fix that. If you've spent time a distance from him, arm's length, I'm here, I kind of want to be a part of this, but I don't really know. This is how you get it done. You just do like Peter did and just hit your knees and just tell him, I'm just a sinner. And he will fix it. And he will start that transformative process. And you won't be different tomorrow in a way that necessarily everybody notices. But you will be changed. And the change just keeps growing over time. Being raised in a good home doesn't make you a flower in the flower bed. Coming to church doesn't make you a flower. Putting on a good show, putting out good blossoms, attracting the bees doesn't make you a flower. You have to get grafted onto the true vine. And that's what I want to encourage you to do today. Lisa, you want to come up here? I want you to be transformed. I want you to be filled with the Spirit. Today's praise songs were so good. There's that line in that first song, Praise. Praise is the water my enemies drown in. I love that line. Is that not an amazing line? I absolutely love that line. Praise is the water my enemy drowns in. I want to encourage you to stand to your feet because it's easier to move when you stand. And I want to encourage you, you're probably in one of two camps. I don't know, maybe one of three camps. I don't know, I didn't think this out. Maybe you're in that first category and it's like, I've been keeping this faith at arm's length and I'm identifying as a Christian, but I'm not really transformed into one. I realize now when I really think about it, I'm not a Peter or a James or a John. I kind of got a Judas tendency to hold everything at arm's length and keep cherry picking the pet sins that I like to pick at. And I'm really not letting Jesus change me into the person that he wants me to be. If that's where you're at, we got altars and you've got God where you're at too. And you can reach out. And I encourage you to reach out to God today and just get transformed. It's not hard. You just tell him that I'm a sinner and I want to be changed and he'll change you. It's not special magic words you got to say. Maybe you are really here and you're sold out and you're a follower of Jesus, but you realize, I'm not praising him like I should. I'm not fully living the walk that he's called me into. I know I've got talents that I'm not putting to good use. I know that there are people I'm supposed to be talking to that I'm not talking to. I know there are things that I'm saying and doing that don't really represent my Christian faith very well. I'm a pretty good Christian at home or at church, but I'm not a great Christian at work among my coworkers. Okay, that's everybody. We all deal with that. And just edge closer to him today. And if you're neither of those, this is the third category that occurred to me after I said, maybe you got it all figured out. And you are 100% just on fire for God and you are who you claim to be all the time. That's awesome. We should all be so fortunate to get there. But I absolutely guarantee there is no way you can say, I'm giving him everything I've got. I am fully living the life he's called me to and that I'm really sold out praising him for all the victories that I see in my life and the lives of the people around me. I guarantee none of us can say that. I encourage you today to just pull a little closer. If you need to be prayed for, we've got altars. We're happy to pray with you. And God is going to meet you where you're at today. I trust that.